The Roman Empire was massive. At its peak, it stretched from the sands of Egypt to the chilly shores of Britain. But despite all their military might and hunger for new lands, the Romans never managed to conquer Ireland. And it wasn't because they didn't think about it. There were plans, there were whispers, there were near attempts, but those plans never materialized. Rome might have conquered Britain, but Ireland, or Hibernia as they called it, was always a step too far. One of the most notable moments when Rome got close was during the reign of Agricola, the Roman governor of Britain in the late 1st century CE. Agricola had been fighting his way through the wild, misty lands of Caledonia, it's modern Scotland, and it seemed like the next logical move would be to hop over to Ireland. Agricola was all in on this idea. He even struck up a deal with an exiled Irish king, who most historians believe to be Tuathal Techtmar. Tuathal had been booted from his throne in Ireland and was looking for a Roman muscle to help him reclaim it. Agricola saw an opportunity. If he helped Tuathal, not only would Rome have a foothold in Ireland, but they could use it to squash any anti-Roman sentiment festering across the Irish Sea. Agricola famously claimed that Ireland could be taken with just one legion and some auxiliary forces. He was confident it would be a walk in the park. After all, Rome had already subdued most of the known world. But despite all the talk, Agricola never pulled the trigger. He was knee-deep in trouble with rebellions in Caledonia, and by the time he got things under control there, his time as governor was up. So the invasion never happened. Instead of marching into Ireland, Agricola packed his bags and headed back to Rome, leaving Tuathal and his exile dreams hanging. It's easy to think what could have been. If Agricola had invaded, Ireland might have ended up just another province of the Roman Empire, its warriors turned into Roman soldiers, its culture molded by Roman law and architecture. But that's not how things played out. Ireland stayed free of Roman rule, and Agricola's plans dissolved into history as just another what-if scenario. If the Romans thought Ireland would be an easy grab, they were in for a rude awakening. Ireland wasn't like Gaul or even Britain. The Irish didn't have massive unified kingdoms or an easily conquerable population. Ireland was a patchwork of small and very fiercely independent kingdoms. Each of these kingdoms was ruled by its own local chieftain. The Romans were used to steamrolling big enemies. The Irish were more like guerrilla fighters. It would have been a nightmare for the Romans if they tried to invade. The terrain in Ireland wasn't doing them any favors either. Roman legions thrived in open fields where they could use their superior formations to crush the enemy. But Ireland was all rocky hills, bogs, and thick forests. It was perfect for ambushes and surprise attacks. The Irish warriors, who knew the land like the back of their hand, would have struck fast and then melted back into the wild before the Romans even knew what hit them. Even if Agricola had managed to land his forces, they would have been playing by Irish rules, and those rules didn't favor slow-moving Roman legions. But it wasn't about the logistics. The Romans were practical conquerors. They didn't invade places just for the fun of it. They wanted something in return, and that's where Ireland fell short. The island didn't have the kind of wealth or resources that Rome usually liked to have when they conquered a place. It had a bunch of fertile land for livestock, and the Romans weren't exactly clamoring for more sheep. There wasn't much gold or silver. The population was smaller and more scattered compared to places like Gaul or Spain. To the Romans, Ireland didn't seem worth the trouble. That's not to say the Romans ignored Ireland entirely. They knew it was there. They traded with the Irish, and Roman goods like wine, olive oil, and jewelry made their way across the sea. But when it came to the question of full-on conquest, Rome hesitated. They had bigger problems to deal with, like rebellions in Britain and unrest in the heart of the empire itself. Conquering Ireland might have looked good on paper, but in reality it would have stretched Roman forces too thin for too little gain. So Ireland stayed out of Rome's grasp, a wild, untamed land at the edge of the known world. Long before he became a saint, before all the parades and shamrocks, Patrick was a teenager in Roman Britain with no idea that his life was about to take a sharp turn. Around the year 400 CE, an Irish raiding party stormed his village, and they weren't messing around. These raids were brutal and fast, catching Roman settlements off guard. Ireland was known for these sudden attacks on the weakening edges of Roman territory, especially in Britain, which was struggling with both external threats and internal chaos. Now, Patrick was only 16 when the Irish swooped in. They kidnapped him with plenty of others, dragging them back across the Irish Sea. You can picture the scene. Chaos, shouting, homes being set on fire. It was a good haul for the raiders. For Patrick, it was the beginning of 6 long years in slavery. He found himself far from home, stuck in the rugged countryside of Ireland, tending sheep on a mountainside for some Irish chieftain. This wasn't the life he'd imagined for himself. The isolation must have been brutal. Alone with the sheep, surrounded by the cold and the wind, Patrick turned to his faith. He prayed constantly, thinking that if he could survive this, maybe there was a bigger purpose for him. And one night, after 6 years of this grueling life, Patrick had enough. He claimed to hear a voice telling him to run, that his ship was waiting for him on the coast. But it wasn't a short run or a short walk. He had to cover more than 200 miles to reach the sea. Not an easy thing to do when you're a runaway slave in a foreign land. But Patrick was determined, and he managed to find the ship, just as he had been promised. The crew didn't really want to take him on at first. He was a stranger, and he had no money to give them for the voyage. But somehow, whether it was luck or fate, they eventually said, "Okay, come aboard." Patrick made it back to Britain. He escaped the clutches of his Irish captors and made it back home. But after a while, he felt like he needed to go back. So he did. This time, instead of as a slave, he made the trip as a missionary. Patrick became one of the most influential figures in Irish history. He ended up bringing Christianity to the island that had once enslaved him. Niall of the Nine Hostages and Tuathal Tecmar are two pretty important rulers of Irish history, especially when you dig into their wild connections with Rome. Their stories are messy. They're a mix of history and legend, but they're definitely interesting. They were kings fighting for control of Ireland, and they had some pretty spectacular run-ins with the Romans. Let's start with Tuathal Tecmar, the exiled prince. This guy's life story reads like a revenge tale. His father, the High King of Ireland, got overthrown while Tuathal was still in the womb. His pregnant mother fled to Roman Britain, which at that time was dealing with its own issues under Roman occupation. For 2 decades, Tuathal grew up in exile, watching and waiting. The plan? To sail back to Ireland, raise an army, and take back his father's throne. Here's where it got Roman. Tuathal allegedly cozied up to Agricola, the Roman governor of Britain, hoping to get some backup for his invasion of Ireland. It's pretty wild to imagine an Irish prince walking into a Roman military camp trying to convince Agricola, the guy who had just fought his way through Caledonia, Scotland, to help him take Ireland. The Romans had plenty of reasons to be interested. They were always looking for ways to control the troublesome Irish settlers who kept hitting Roman Britain. And helping Tuathal could have meant securing a loyal ally across the Irish Sea. But for whatever reason, probably because the Romans were dealing with rebellions in Britain and couldn't commit, the invasion never happened. Tuathal ended up sailing back to Ireland on his own, gathering local forces and going on a tear across the island to reclaim his throne. But here's where things got really interesting. Some historians think that even if the Romans didn't officially back Tuathal, they might have helped him in smaller, less obvious ways. Archaeological digs in places like Drumnah and Lampay Island, both close to where Tuathal reportedly landed, have unearthed Roman artifacts like coins and pottery, even Roman-styled fortifications. Was this just trade, or did the Romans have a more direct hand in helping Tuathal? It's still up for debate. Maybe the Romans saw an opportunity in Ireland but decided it wasn't worth a full invasion. Then there's Niall of the Nine Hostages. This guy was basically Ireland's king of chaos. His raids on Roman Britain were the stuff of nightmares for the people living on the fringes of the empire. Roman Britain was already on shaky ground, dealing with internal decay and external threats, and then Niall swoops in, leading raid after raid. And it wasn't a one-off thing. He kept hitting Britain hard enough that some sources even suggest he died during one of these raids. The idea of a legendary Irish king dying on Roman soil says a lot about how intertwined these two worlds were at the time. And here's the kicker. Some accounts link Niall's raids to the capture of none other than St. Patrick. That's right. Niall's men may have been the ones who dragged young Patrick across the sea and into slavery. That's some serious influence, even if it wasn't the kind Niall was going for. Even though the Romans never officially conquered Ireland, it wasn't like the two sides were completely cut off from each other. In fact, they had a pretty steady trade relationship going on. It's not like the Irish were living in some remote bubble. They were well aware of the Roman Empire, and the Romans knew about Ireland. The Irish were not raiding Roman Britain all the time. When they weren't pillaging the countryside, they were busy trading with the Romans, exchanging goods and, more importantly, ideas. Roman coins, jewelry, and pottery had been found in Ireland, evidence of a trade network that spanned the Irish Sea. Olive oil and wine were particularly prized by the Irish, and it's not hard to imagine why. These luxuries were not exactly common in Ireland, and getting your hands on some Roman wine, well, that must have felt like a serious status symbol. In return, the Irish offered up cattle, hides, and likely even slaves. Yes, people were very much a part of this trade network, and Irish slaves could be found in Roman Britain just as easily as Roman slaves ended up in Ireland. But it wasn't about the goods. Trade meant people were traveling back and forth. With them came stories and news and culture. Roman influence was everywhere. It was bound to trickle into Ireland. Roman coins were used as currency. Roman fashion found its way into Irish homes. But probably the most significant thing the Romans brought to Ireland was Christianity. Christianity was the state religion of Rome by the 4th century. Irish traders and slaves who came into contact with Roman Britain started hearing about this guy named Jesus, and it didn't take long for it to hop over to Ireland. Today, Ireland is almost 70% Catholic. Thanks for watching. What other conquests do you want to learn about? Well, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, ring the bell, share this video with a friend, and all that good stuff to stay up to date with all the nutty stories from human history.